I take it that all of you, or most of you, would know what a bucket list is. A bucket list is, it was a few months ago that this sermon came about. Debbie's mother, who was 93, we heard that she was going to die. We knew that long time ago, but we knew that now it was going to happen. And I said to Debbie that we need to make sure what we do when that happens. She was the last of the 4 of our parents still alive. And with Debbie's condition, it's difficult to travel alone. And we had already booked to come now. Just to make sure you all understand, we come from here, so all our family lives in South Africa, and so the mother was here as well in Pretoria. And so I said to Debbie, we need to make sure that we know what we're going to do so that we do not have any regrets afterwards. And we spoke it through. I asked her to phone her siblings and to chat to them, and the siblings all felt that it was okay, we need not come when that happens. And we prayed about it, and we had a peace that we do not come. And out of that, together with one other aspect, is that a couple that used to lead Cornerstone, Jim and Margaret Lamont, now living in LA, we had heard that they have Alzheimer's, and I had phoned and spoken to them, and I wasn't sure if they really knew who I was. They acted as if, but I wasn't sure, and that saddened me. From time to time, we do speak to each other, but the last while it seemed like it's been getting worse. And so in those two aspects, thinking of, I want to live in such a way that there are no regrets at the end of the journey. And so I preached this on Sunday, and on Tuesday, Debbie's mother passed away. And then we knew we'd made the decision not to come back at that stage, and so that's how this whole thing of a bucket list came about. And so I'd like to ask just a few of you to call out, what do you have on your bucket list? When I asked this question that Sunday in church, Debbie said from the front row, a camper trip to Norway. And I know that's something that you would like to do. But what do you have on your list? Shout. Skydiving, I hear somebody. Who's that, 90-year-old lady? Oh, no, okay. No, not 90-year-old. Hot air balloon? Not? So, camper trip anyway would be great. For some, it may be saying, one day I'd like to run a marathon, or skydiving. I had bungee jumping on my list. Not that I want to do that, but that could be. But for some, it may be doing a trip back to a place that has special memories for you. I was born in Parijs, in die Vrystaat. I don't need you to feel sorry for me. But it was many, many years ago that I wanted to show my kids and that, so we did a trip through Paris on our way back from somewhere. But for some people, it may be back, and as you get older, once my mother came back to Holland, she was already in her 80s then, and she wanted to go back to this house in Amsterdam where she was born. So we took her to the place. So that could be on your bucket list. It could be something very practical, like becoming debt-free. I think that there are some things that should be on our bucket list. It may be making arrangements for your old age. And when you are young, it looks far away, but I've seen around me also, friends, also in ministry, the sadness that comes about because those things were not thought about. It could be something very, very practical, like drawing up your last will and testament. I've also seen the pain and the heartache that has come about when people have not had such a thing. Many years ago, I was in Australia, about 10 or 12 years ago, I forget, 10 years, I think. And my son-in-law then said, "Dad, you want to go with a friend and myself to watch a movie?" And I went. I enjoy movies. I don't often go to the movie house. I prefer to watch it in my lounge. But I went with them, and it was the movie called The Bucket List. Who's seen it? Not so many. The Bucket List is a movie about a wealthy businessman and a man who has been a motor mechanic for 45 years. The wealthy businessman becomes sick and gets taken up, admitted to hospital. The mechanic also becomes sick and gets admitted into the same room where the wealthy man is. And so they meet each other for the first time. Both have been diagnosed with cancer. And while there, the mechanic begins to write a bucket list, the things he would like to do before he dies. But when he hears that he has less than a year to live, he takes the piece of paper, frommels it up, I don't know what the English word is, and he throws it on the floor. The wealthy man finds this piece of paper lying on the floor next to his bed. He picks it up, he opens it up, and he reads it. And he sees that it's the bucket list of his newfound friend, the mechanic. And so he urges his new friend to do everything that is on the list. And he says to his friend, "I'm a wealthy man. I have a lot of money. I cannot take it with me. I will pay for us together to do this bucket list of yours." The mechanic agrees, despite the protests of his wife. And Edward and Carter, those are their names, begin their around-the-world vacation. The two terminally ill patients, because the wealthy man was also diagnosed that he would die shortly. The two terminally ill patients set off together to make as many wishes possible. They do everything that was on Carter's bucket list, and when they return, he dies. Imagine if you knew that you did not have long to live. What would you still like to do? Now, your list may change from the things that you've said, because now suddenly there are things that would be more important to you. Not that those things are wrong, but you begin to prioritize. What will your response be if you knew that Jesus would return within the next year? We sing about his return. We speak about his return. We long for his return, and sometimes we really desperately long for his return because of the problems we're in. But what would you do? What would you put on your list if you knew for sure that within the next year or so, Jesus would return? What would you then still want to do? What is there that you should have on your bucket list? I have a few examples. Perhaps it is to fulfill a promise you've made to yourself or to someone else or even to the Lord, but you've forgotten about it, you've not kept it, you've not fulfilled it. And so now you put on your bucket list, I want to fulfill that promise. Perhaps it should be to admit something that you've done wrong or where you failed in, and you've tried to just cover it up and push it aside. And perhaps you've even been asked, did you do it? And you're always denying it. And so there is something that is like a chain in your life because you keep on denying that, And somehow, every now and then it comes up and it bugs you because you know you've not been truthful. It may even be admitting it to yourself. Perhaps it may be to resolve a conflict that you're in, and to work at reconciliation of that estranged relationship that you're in. 2 years ago, a lady in our church died. And I'd met her about 1.5 years before when she came to our church, she and her husband. And then we got talking, I meet them and talking, and then I hear that they have 3 children, married, grandchildren. But with the oldest son, who apparently is a Christian, he's an elder in another church, they've not seen each other, spoken to each other, or at random they have, but for 20 years or so. And the parents say they don't understand what the real issue is, why they are not allowed to have any contact. They send birthday cards, they send messages when they move, but there's no contact. So I asked them, could I try? And so I phoned the church where apparently they were at, and I asked if I could have the telephone number, and of course they didn't know who I am, but eventually I got the telephone number and I phoned him. And I said to him, your mother is dying, and she would love still to see you. And he wasn't very happy that I'd phoned, and he said, I want no contact with my parents. Now, I don't know what happened. I heard the story of the parents. When she died, he did not come to the funeral. And the siblings didn't know how they would handle it if he did appear at the funeral. Estranged relationships are not unknown, even within the church. And so maybe that may be something to put on the list. Or it may be to forgive someone. To forgive someone who has hurt you, wronged you. I've been amazed over the years in our church, the people that have come in, and the ladies who have been victim of sexual abuse. There have been those who have been abused by their fathers. We've had people who have been abused by fathers and brothers. There was one that was abused by grandfather. And there have been a few that have been abused also by other men. Sexually abused. And then somewhere along the line comes this pain because they are challenged, confronted with the truth of having to forgive, according to the Bible. And for many, forgiveness in their thinking means that what he did was not wrong. That's not what forgiveness means. The one with the grandfather who had no contact with the grandfather came and asked, married woman, mother of teenagers, how can I go about this? Because it's so difficult. No contact with grandpa and grandma. Family don't understand it because she's not told everyone. And I don't know how long he still lived, but eventually she went to grandpa. I can't remember if he admitted it, because in some cases there's another lady who has gone and challenged, and the father still denies that he ever did it. In fact, he did it with all 3 the daughters, but still denies that it ever happened. Perhaps that's on your list. Perhaps you fell pregnant and you didn't want the child, and you gave the child, or you had an abortion, or you gave the child up for adoption. And now that I mention it, you try not to think of it, and now I mention it, and there's hurt comes to the fore. You may feel guilty. You need to experience God's forgiveness toward you. It may also be that you need to forgive yourself. Perhaps you've been a bad parent. You didn't know better. Maybe you knew better, but you just were so interested in other things. And so on your bucket list should be to forgive yourself for being a bad parent and asking your children to forgive you. Ephesians 4 verse 26 says, in your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath. There was no wrath between Debbie's mother and us, But we knew that the sun was setting, and we wanted to make sure that there was nothing when the sun set, and even as much as if we did not go or did go to the funeral, that there would be no regrets. And the sun set, and we have no regrets. When she did die, as a side to this sermon, I was hoping that the siblings would say, come, because I thought it was a nice opportunity to come to South Africa. But they still said, no. And do not give the devil a foothold, says verse 27. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God. And a little further, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. 24 and a bit years ago, when we left to go to Holland from South Africa, Debbie's father, who had also been born in Holland but came here as a teenager, and we shared with them, and we had our 2 children then at the point of leaving, 10 and 12 years old. Debbie's father in the process said, how come you want to go to that small, backward, in his eyes, country, because it's small and everybody lives on it, so close together. It's not that bad, but that's some places it is. And I remember that they were in Belita on holiday, and we'd borrowed we went on holiday just before we left, just to say our goodbyes, and that we went to Belita where they were on holiday. We spent a night or 2 with them, and we got back in the car, and he said to Debbie, I know it's going to be tough, but when it's tough, don't call me, and know that I'm not going to be crying for you. We're saying goodbye with our 2 children. In their presence, he says this. We get in the car, the tears start rolling because of the hard words spoken by this man. We chose there not to let this become an issue. We drove off back to Johannesburg, and 2 or 3 days later, after saying goodbye to my parents, we left. When we were there, we arrived, we had settled in our home, and we wrote our first letter, as you do it in those days. You write your first letter about what, and we made a few comments, and back comes a fax from her dad. How can you say those things? And sarcastic remarks. 18 months later, we come back for our first trip to South Africa, Debbie and I, and we come from Cornerstone, and Cornerstone was going to have a weekend camp. And so we landed in Joburg and on the Friday or so, and so we decided that we would first go to the camp. But from the church office, we phoned to say hi to our parents and that we're in the country. And the father says, are they more important than we are, that you first go back to the church and don't come to the family? And so after that, we went to the family first every time. Or we didn't tell them we were in the country until we went. But we did. We made sure that we went to the family. We asked God to help us not to allow that to come up. There was never any antagonism. He never said, but it was a painful issue. And we wanted to honor our parents, and so we did this. He was a wealthy man. He never once offered to pay. While others paid for our trip sometimes, he never offered to pay. He was never ugly after that. He did once ask me, how's it going in the church, but never otherwise. And so we went there, we spent time with him, we enjoyed it fine. He died in 2004, April 2004. There was nothing in us that we regretted because we'd lived. We'd never spoken about those issues with him, but we lived without any hurt and bitterness in our hearts. He died suddenly. No regrets for us. When he died, we were surprised what he left for us. That enabled us, because we had no pension, nothing. enabled us to put something away for which we are very grateful to the Lord. But more grateful than that is that we never allowed a root of bitterness to grow. And so we didn't have to tick that thing off our bucket list. Not one of us knows that we will not die within the next few months or within the next year. None of us knows for certain that Jesus will not come back in the next 6 months. James 4 verse 13 says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, we'll spend a year there, we'll carry on business and make money. Why do you not even know what will happen? Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist. Richard, you are a mist. You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. When we have that reality, we will keep short lists. When we have that reality, we will, by the grace of God, be able to deal with those things where people offend us and not allow it to become an issue in our lives. I don't want to say that we've not had issues. We've had issues. We've had struggles with people. It's taken years to sort things out. I can honestly say now that especially 3 relationships in Holland that I've had that have been painful, accusations made about me, spread about me, painful things. I now have coffee with all 3 of those people, but it took a long time. I don't want to say that now it's all hunky-dory in that sense, but I have no issue. I can face them, I can smile with them, I can laugh with them, I can joke with them. But it had to be ticked off because I knew I could die like this. And I didn't want that to be an issue. We do not know when we will die. Only those who are terminally ill know it's nearby. For the rest of us, it could be a big surprise. Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 5 and he says, be very careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but be wise in the way that you live, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. It was a wonderful theme this week about taking your mountain. And all of that went, what is God calling you to? Is it a housewife? Is it to be a plumber? Is it to be a lawyer? Is it to be a doctor? Whatever it may be. Live wisely in that call that God has for you. Make the most of your time. Pay attention to how you live and be sure that you can come to the end of the road and not have those regrets. Perhaps on your bucket list should be to grow in your relationship with Jesus and in becoming more like Him. Paul says, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection. Paul writes elsewhere, I pray for me that I may fearlessly proclaim the mystery of the gospel. I pray that that may increase in my life in the last lap that I have. To proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, the mystery of the gospel, and to do so fearlessly. Perhaps it may be on your bucket list to become less self-centered and arrogant and have more empathy for people. Wonderful to see how the people gathered around that man who did not know what, I think he doesn't really know what is happening. He stood there with his eyes closed. But I saw him hugging a few people afterwards. But some of us can be callous and hard and not want to do, maybe on the bucket list, to become more sensitive to people, more loving. Perhaps it is to become friendlier and more compassionate, or to work on your pessimism and critical attitude. Perhaps it is to become more committed as a follower of Christ and become more involved in the things of the kingdom. Perhaps God is speaking to you this morning to make adjustments in your life. Perhaps for some, it may be to worry less and fret less. A few years ago, we were confronted with an issue or two, and it really shook Debbie and myself, and we began to worry about our future. And it gripped us. Everything was whatever. Actually, we were hoping that we would die soon. You don't want to get old. Debbie's still hoping that for me. No, I'm joking. But I mean, for me, it was an issue that I prayed. I said, Lord, I'm being gripped by worry because of the future. Maybe that's on the bucket list. Or perhaps, in a positive sense, to become an encourager, blowing wind into the sails of other people within your family, or to let someone know that you appreciate him or her and why. I have made a point of thanking the Lord regularly for those men and women who've had a great impact in my life. And I've thanked some of them. I read a book, it was 3 years ago, I was given a book, and my name is mentioned in the book. It's by a South African guy who was my youth leader when I was a young chappie. And I remember that his name is Dougie Thompson, and Dougie Thompson was mad with the kids. He was fun in that. You don't need somebody at that age who tells you these are the books of the Bible and you must know them off by hand, you must know. No, he just lived his excitement with Jesus, and he had an impact on my life. And so years ago, I'm friends with his brother and the wife of the... So they gave me a book that he'd written. It was his sort of testimony. And so they gave it to me, and I read it, and he mentions me in the book. That one of his youth club guys has now planted a church where did we plant? Oh, in Holland, yes. And so there was an email address of his, so I wrote an email, and I said, I just want to thank you for the impact you had on my life. And so there have been different people. Ivan Foster, some of you may know him. He led a church here at Harvest. Ivan was the man that I got to know when I was 16. He was my confirmation teacher in the Methodist church. My mother led us to the Lord. My mother was the spiritual person. My father only came to know the Lord late in life. But my father was not a dad. My dad taught me how to weld. He taught me how to work on cars and do plumbing and that. But he never taught me how to live as a man. And in their marriage, I saw things that when I went to Hatfield and heard things about, I said, I want to do it differently. But Ivan, I went to him and I spoke to him about things. When I got the first interest in a girl, I spoke to Ivan. And Ivan was one of two people who, when I left school and I started doing a trade, I felt the call of God on my ministry, and I had a girlfriend, and I had her for 2.5 years. But when they also felt that the call of God for my life was ministry in the area that I am now, in the way I am now, Ivan was one of two men that said to me, does Marion fit into your life regarding the call of God? And they doubted it. And so I broke up with Marion. The only thing I regret is the way in which I broke up with Marion. I don't know where she is today. I pray for her sometimes. So I heard some years ago, I heard that Ivan had moved to America and somebody had got his number. So I asked him for the phone number, and I phoned Ivan, and I said, Ivan, I just want to thank you and Lynn for the role you played in shaping me. And then there have been the Dudleys, and the one that has had the most impact in my life and our lives is Leon van Dahl. And so I regularly thank him, send him an app. I have regular contact with Leon. And maybe you need to put on your bucket list. Maybe it's your own biological father. It could be. Even if you are sure that you still have a long time to live, you do not know how long the person in question will be alive. The person that you have in your mind now, maybe just to let him know, you've been such an example to me in that area. I just wanted you to know, I am so encouraged when I see you working with those children, just what you do, I want to blow wind in your sails. But the other thing is, you may not know how long that person lives, and you may be sure, because the doctor has given you a clean bill of health, and you can still live 10 years, but you don't know what your mental condition will be. Yeah. One of the things that led to the sermon was that Debbie's sister, whom we are friends with, and that always we go to their house when we come here, and they provide us with cars. She was very ill in the beginning of the year, and they spoke about dementia. She's my age. And so it touched us. And we thought, what happens if? Now they've concluded that it's not that, and she's doing much better. But you don't know. You don't know. In the movie, it's a German movie, and it's called Honig im Kopf, which means head in my honey, and they want to bring out an English movie called, then based on that, called A Head, Honey in My Head. In English, it's going to be called, the movie, I think, A Head Full of Honey. In this movie, a retired vet called Amandus suffers from Alzheimer's disease. Amandus is a widower and no longer able to live on his own. So his son Nico convinces Amandus to move into their house. Nico and Sarah, his wife, have one daughter, the 11-year-old Tilda. Tilda and her grandfather have a unique and very close relationship. His mental state continues to degrade. When he realizes what the terrible consequences of this disease can be, he decides to write. So Tilda, who loves her grandfather so dearly and sees this, what the first bit was that's not him. She comes across to her grandfather, and that's what you heard him there a little, and he says that he is wanting to write something, but he can't anymore. And so he's crying. He's realizing that his Alzheimer is getting worse and worse. And so he tells her what to write. So she writes and he says to her, so she makes suggestions. He says, no, I will tell you what to write. So she writes it. And Tilda had spoken once to her doctor, the pediatrician, about her grandfather. And the pediatrician tells her that visiting places that the sick person knows well can help him or her to live with the disease in a better way. So Tilda wants to travel with her grandpa to Venice, where Grandpa met his wife and where they went on honeymoon when they got married. And so eventually they go on this journey. They don't tell the parents. She doesn't tell her parents, but she takes Grandpa and they go, and they end up, after quite an eventful journey, they end up in Venice. And she books into a hotel and uses Grandpa's credit card. He gives it to her to book them into the hotel. And during the night, the first night there, the granddad gets up and he leaves the hotel unnoticed. He's confused. In the morning, when Tilda discovers that her grandpa's not there, she is in panic, of course, and she immediately goes off to look for him. And she has to cross one of the waterways in Venice. And after some time, sitting on the boat, looking, she sees her grandfather sitting on one of the sides on a bench. She jumps off the boat, swims to the side, and runs to her grandpa. And that's what I would like to show you in the second one, but you can't see it now. You'll have to wait till the English movie comes out. She runs up to her grandpa and she says, "Grandpa, Grandpa, why have you done this?" And he says, "Who are you?" She says, "Come, Grandpa, we must go back to the hotel." And he gets cross and he says, "Leave me alone, I don't know you." And there the tears began to roll across her cheeks as she's sitting there next to the grandpa she loves so dearly. And out of her pocket, she takes a piece of paper and she opens it up and she reads the following. "For Tilda, my beloved granddaughter, the day will come when I will no longer know that you are my granddaughter. There is one thing I want you to know. I love you, and you are the best princess that I could ever have wished for." He did something in order to alleviate the pain. Of course, there was pain. But he did something to alleviate her pain when that day would eventually come. May I ask you, have you adjusted your bucket list in the last 30 minutes? Taken some things off and added some other things? Perhaps there's something that you would rather ignore. It's on your bucket list, but you would rather ignore. Or perhaps there's something that you should have on there or have put on there, but you don't have any idea as to how you must fulfill it. Ask somebody. If you've been touched and you need to go to somebody and ask him to forgive you, maybe it's a grandfather that has abused you, and you don't know how. Speak to somebody you trust and say, I want to do this, but I don't know how. We don't have all the answers. I'm grateful that there have been men and women who have helped me through things in my life where I've said, I don't know what to do. Help me. It may also be that you would want to go back to the person, but he's no longer alive or she's no longer alive. Then don't start hitting yourself. Bring it to the Lord and do it in your heart. I don't know where Marion is, but many a time when it comes to the fore again, I say, Lord, I don't know where Marion is. I don't know where she's living where she's at in life. You have forgiven me. And I know that once you've forgiven it, but again, I want to say, I'm sorry for the way I broke up with her, and just minister healing to her. Perhaps you don't know where the person is. It's possible. And sometimes it's not wise to go back to the person. For me, it wouldn't be wise. And so you need to deal with it in the Lord and your own attitude. But whatever it is, I want to say to you, do all you can to please the Lord and live that way each day. Not to have regrets. Do everything within your means. It's not always possible, but do everything within your means to resolve any unfinished business. So that when you get to the pearly gates, and you were asked, is there any unfinished work? You can say, Lord, I've done everything I knew I was required to do. See to it that you reach your end without regrets. I close with two scriptures. Paul, writing to the Philippians, where he says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. He writes on later in verse 12b of chapter 3, Philippians, I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. Forgetting what is behind. There are hurts in the past. There may be even victories we are not proud of. There may be disappointments, but forgetting those things because we've dealt with them and they're under the blood of Jesus. Forgetting those things, what is behind, I strain towards what is ahead. I press on towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenwards in Christ Jesus. And in the terms, in the language of the past few days, I press on regardless to take a hold of that mountain. And to Timothy then he says, so he's pressing on, and we are to press on and take hold of that which God has for me, and to work those things off our bucket list, and leave the nice things, the trips to whatever. And if you don't ever do that skydiving thing, or you never get to Norway with your camper, then it's no loss, because you've dealt with the issues that you had about your dad. And you've dealt with that issue with that pastor that you had problems with and made life very difficult for you, because these things happen. And Paul writes, that was what his longing was. And then he comes to the end of his life and he knows he hasn't long to live anymore. And then he writes to Timothy, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I've kept the faith. There's nothing more that I have to deal with right now. Yes, there are things I would still love to do. I would still love to go to South Africa, Paul could have said, and I would still love to have gone to Hong Kong to reach people there. But there's nothing that deters me from looking at the face of my Lord and King and hearing Him say, well done, you good and faithful servant. Let's pray. Help us, Father, to respond this morning to whatever your Spirit lays His finger on. Perhaps it's not having to forgive someone else. Perhaps it's not even having to forgive ourselves or even you. But perhaps it's just receiving healing for hurt and pain. Perhaps it's you making adjustments this morning. Making adjustments to our bucket list. Perhaps there are things that are not in any way negative that we need to deal with, but perhaps you are saying something, I have a plan for you and you've never asked me what it is. Whatever it may be, the fact is we do not know how long we have to live. Help us to live in such a way that every day when we close our eyes at the end of it, we may know there is no unfinished business. And Father, where there are issues and we do not know how to resolve it, we do not know what to do, we may be fearful even of the response, because sometimes we can go to somebody and say, I'd like to sort it out with you, and then the person responds in a terrible way. But thank you that you give grace and will help us. And so, Father, I pray that you will help us to live wisely and to press on and take a hold of that which you have for us, so that at the end we may say, I've kept the faith, I've run the race, I've fulfilled God's purpose for my life in this generation. Lord, I'm ready to meet you. I'm ready to go home. And in the meantime, help us to press on in everything you have for us, and to take our mountains and to blow wind into the sails of others, to be followers where we are to be followers, and to be leaders where we are to be leaders, and in it all to know Jesus more and more and to make him known. Amen.